one phrase that we might use in order to describe the situation we are now in is meta-crisis. Meta-crisis meaning that there was a large number of individual crises that are occurring in parallel, and we recognize that we cannot solve them at the level we created them, which almost feels trivial to say it like that now. We have to, there is something that connects all of these crises, and that ultimately is summarized maybe in the way we think, needs to rise to the challenge. So we lump them all together, we call it a meta-crisis, and we address the shift in thinking. And then you quite nicely, just in the last answer, talked about the differentiation of your view of regeneration from the view of Carol Sanford and Regenesis, Pamela Mang, and so forth. And if I understand correctly, so here's my first question, you're saying that there is a certain idealistic assumption in the work of Carol Sanford where a system has a certain state of health that we need to that we can get back into, as opposed to seeing the system itself as part of in development. Have I summarized that correctly?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think they would feel fairly represented. Their understanding of what health is about is that health is this falling back into a perfect state, and rather than understanding health as dynamic, evolutionary, and regenerative. But everything else they do, even and like to finish your question with regard to the meta-crisis, but even like they have a very powerful response to this crisis problem-based approach. But yeah, please continue your question.
I'm very interested in their work and also in yours. And for me, there's a tension between the two that I haven't yet managed to resolve for myself entirely. So I feel that whenever I get into a situation like that there has to be another level of integration that allows the duality to exist, if that makes any sense. But speaking of many different aspects, what for you are the hallmarks of the meta-crisis we live through at the moment? So I said it's a crisis of thinking. How would you describe it?
Well, I mean, people have all sorts of, we have a water, energy, and climate crisis problem in the framing of a lot of people. We have lots of well-meaning people working really hard day in, day out to race to zero carbon, seeing the world through a carbon myopic climate change response. And they're all good people and they all mean well. And then we have one COP where we have 50,000 people descend on Egypt to talk about the climate, which is bizarre. And then a few days later, we have another COP to talk about nature-based services and like quantifying and monetizing nature so we can save it. What happens there is that a approach to crisis or problem, to situation, plays out. And that's what I learned through Carol Sanford and through Regenesis Group, and why I so deeply am in debt to their 25 years of regenerative practice in all I do. I don't really disagree with them on most things, many things, but that issue about health is a specific one that we simply don't seem to be able to evolve together, which I've been trying for a long time. But what I've learned from them, that Carol Sanford points out so clearly, is we have all been trained through education to look at the world through problems, that we then have disciplines and the might of experts in disciplines take perspectives on the problem And then we bring them all together in large conferences. And once they've defined the problem in the abstract from 15 different disciplines in all detail and shown how it shows up in every place on the planet, so it's a globalizable problem that we all need to deal with, then we bring in the financiers who say, yes, let's do a little competition with the designers and the technologists and find solutions to this problem. For like, let's bring them all together for 5 days and do a hackathon or a sandbox or a design sprint or whatever you want to name it. And then the best 10 get our funding to do a startup, and we launch it, and and then we have the solution, and then we bring more funding in, and then we force it on everybody in the planet because it's the solution. And that's the pathway that happens when you take everything through problem, abstraction of problem, find solution, and then bring the solution back to the specific. What Karis Hanford and Regenesis have been about in all their work is to remind people and to bring the dialogue to the group of people they're working with to say, okay, well, that is all a bit abstract and it doesn't make sense to me. Can we go into the specific? Where do you live? Who do you talk to? Who's against it? Who's for it? What have they had for breakfast and where did it come from? Like, in the sense of what is the specific of the place that you're trying to have agency in and that you're actually capable of having agency in because you are in that place. And then suddenly you have two ways of reducing complexity here. Either you look at it as abstract problems, or you reduce complexity so you can respond to it to the level through specificity. Suddenly, hunger, energy crisis, food crisis, brittle supply chains, pandemic response, all shows up in every single place, but it shows up differently in a different ecosystem, in a different culture with a different history, in response to all these things, and so on. And what they're saying is, if we want to have a snowball's chance in hell to respond to the polycrisis, let's not think of it as a polycrisis. Let's come home to place. Let's understand that if we all, in a cosmopolitan bioregionalism, full awareness that everybody needs to do this in their place, and that it's not about, we Western privileged people can afford to do this here, and let's forget about Africa and the other people, they better sort out their region and then we'll all be fine. We need to address past colonialism problems and economic injustice and help people everywhere to start the process of meeting what you call the polycrisis in place. And you, I mean, you named the worldview bit, which is interesting because when you actually sit in place, in my book, I call it living the questions together. You don't look at the solutions. It's not about solutions. Of course you need them and somebody needs to propose them and you need to experiment with them, but at a scale where the feedback from the impact of those solutions is quick enough that we can course correct them or actually abandon them. And if we don't look at them as final products, but understand every solution as a stepping stone in learning, and we live the question continuously whether our past solutions are still fit for today, then we look at the fact that we can't avoid but live in the world that our ancestors did or our predecessors designed for us. And we either accept that world or we transform it. And some of it is worth transforming and some of it is worth accepting. And some of it is worth recovering because we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater more than once in human history. And I could go on forever, but I don't have these endless monologues, sorry.
It's fascinating to hear you explain the background to your thinking a little more. I want to take this conversation about health and move it into the particular space of our relationship with nature. I am involved very much with agriculture. For me, one of the arenas in which the tragedy of being human plays out is the engagement with nature, but through the production of food and what we think about that. And my there's a lot to the approach that I've developed, but one aspect that is very central to it is that we work with Alan Savory's holistic management approach, where context is everything. Context is, so every problem, as you say, is first and foremost a question of the holistic context, and the holistic context always requires that I bring myself to it. I will not find a solution unless I have an outcome in mind. And this is part of my approach to regeneration, is that regeneration is ultimately tied to outcomes. We cannot have a standard operating procedure that pursues an abstract goal. We have to have something that we are pursuing in the field, underneath our feet, with the people that are part of the local community. But it still begs the question, what actually is a healthy relationship with nature? And that question deliberately sets up nature as separate to humans, because that's one of the core dualities we've got at the moment. So I'm wondering, what do you personally see as a healthy relationship to nature?
The thing is that you always mention so many interesting things to hook into, so I will get there eventually, but just briefly, I mean, of course, agriculture, I think, has a lot to do with the place where we started to create the conditions through the technology of the plow that allowed us to be sedentary and therefore begin a different relationship with resources that ultimately led to construct sort of power over type situations. And so in many ways, like if you look at Cook arriving in Australia and saying the Aborigines didn't practice agriculture, they actually practiced an agriculture system so far advanced that it was indistinguishable from what Cook thought was just the wild forest. And they did so over vast distances divided into 8 seasons, where they knew when to be where and disturb how, in order to make that place more abundant. And you'll recognize this from how holistic land management works in terms of disturbing and rotational grazing and all those kind of practices. They mimic the natural regeneration process that is both in all of the larger transforming whole that we are part of, where we're not separate from what we call nature, but we're fundamentally participants in it, emergent properties of it. And so outcomes, yes, but I always liked, in a conversation with Bill Reed, the Regenesis approach to working with people in place, in context, on a specific project that does get executed and does get built or co-created, is to, at all the steps of the way, be aware that the process, coming back to Whitehead and participatory knowing, the process by which we co-create these outcomes creates the most important outcome, which is capacity. The capacity of people in place to do it again, or to tweak it, or to transform it when it needs transforming. If the outcome is delivering what the design brief asked you to deliver, and give them the key and say, here, and call us, or here's a maintenance contract for the next 10 years, that's a solution. That's not the solution that is a prototype that has been co-developed with the people to say, you've learned a lot on this. We learned a lot of this. Like we've actually ended up implementing something completely else than we started doing when we first started talking to each other. And I think you'll recognize this also from holistic land management, that you need that flexibility in the system, and that ultimately the outcome is learning to learn the questions together even better, is continuous awareness of how our participatory, unavoidable interference with a place is either degenerative or regenerative, and we need to pay attention to this. And now you might want to repeat the final question you got to, because I think I took a detour.
No, so one individual that helped me open this space that you've gone into a little bit more is Ethan Soloviev, another a Carol Sanford student, or master pupil, whatever you want to call him. He says that we are going to struggle if we define regeneration, because we're going to only be able to do that now with the knowledge, language, etc. as we stand here. So rather we need to understand it as a continuum, and open ourselves up to the ever greater seeing, ever greater understanding of what regeneration might mean. It is an evolutionary process.
Absolutely, Ethan is so spot on with this, particularly with regard to this, because the current rapid take-up of the meme regenerative everywhere means that the usual suspects run the usual program in the usual way with a new adjective in front. And they're not meaning badly, but they're professionals. They're trying to feed their families. They're doing what they always done. They just close the file on lean and on integral and on smart, and they open the file that says regenerative, and they dump lots of stuff in. I don't want to know how many of my Medium blogs are in there, and they don't read them, unfortunately.
Beautiful.
But the issue is that we now will, and this is where, again, dancing with Carol, and like, I hope I get to speak to Carol, because we've never spoken. Can you believe it? It's bizarre. But I have spoken a lot with Pamela and Ben and Bill and all these people. We can either say you don't get it. If you're trying to create a regenerative agriculture certification scheme, you've already lost the plot and you're not being regenerative anymore. And they're absolutely right, yes. And there's a skillful means that says, don't hit them in the head and say, you bad student, Zen stick, boom. Say, okay, if you hold your certification scheme lightly enough, we can learn something from it. But the danger, of course, is the minute it then just gets put into business as usual and invested into it, then it actually becomes a corset, and it avoids exactly what Ethan was pointing to, the ability of the system to be meaningful in context and break the rules, because the rules are written by the place and not by us. And the rules emerge in the dynamic relationship between climate, us, the place, water availability, people moving in and out, you name it. It's a complex, dynamic, fundamentally uncontrollable and unpredictable system. The best thing we can do is aim for appropriate participation. That's what I learned in the Masters of Holistic Science from Brian Goodwin. And it's different from the kind of holistic notion of building the perfect whole, like which permaculture sometimes likes to do. It's participatory. It's paying attention to the whole role that we have in it. And I love Ethan's work, and I think regenerative agriculture will somehow play out this field of how do we keep people engaged. And we, for example, you can run a classic questionnaire on, is your farm regenerative? And it is a living the questions. But if you do it just as an exercise to put another label on your produce, then you've missed the plot. But if you use it as a, whoa, that's a whole different way of doing agriculture. Okay, we'll plant trees. Okay, let's plant trees. And like agroforestry, all these different tools, like the toolbox is growing every day, particularly as we're acknowledging that we're not the pioneers. We're the quick learners who finally realized that the pioneers have been among us all the time, and we had the arrogance to call them primitive cultures. I mean, that's as embarrassing as it got. And in seeing that, we see that some of these cultures have developed beautiful place-based adaptations, like growing underground in sunken greenhouses in dry conditions. Is something that I want to try out in the food forest I just planted here, because I'm kind of 280 kilometers from the north coast of Africa. It's going to get hot. Anyway.
But the notion that I found very helpful here is to see, let thy food be thy medicine. But as I explored that more, I recognized so much that we try in our life to break things down into, say, moments or little packages, like the food somehow transports health, right? I imbibe health and then I'm healthy. But what I recognized is that actually this whole thing is not just the doing, and it's not just the being. It's, as Claudius in the introduction was pointing to, there's actually a co-evolution going on of the world that I am looking at and the world that is looking at me. We are becoming together in the process, and I have active agency in that. Not a special kind of agency, just a relevant kind of agency. I am relevant to the system and I can influence it and it influences me. So I'm in danger of going off piece, having said that I was going to bring it all back. But the important point for me was that food is just another angle. Agriculture is just another angle on the particular problem of a regenerative mindset around what we eat is related to what we think. And I just wondered whether you had a comment.
Absolutely. There's the problem of the problem again. Like of seeing things as a problem, but what you pointed towards for me is like this Wendell Berry quote. The problem is that we have a food system that has no idea about the health system, and we're having a health system that has no idea about the food system, or something along those lines. And even now, like where in the space of regenerative agriculture, the world has picked up quicker than in a lot of areas. And even these large incumbents are seemingly moving into that space in a way that, well, makes my fingernails roll up a little bit. But this understanding that we need a new food system is now everywhere. And there are 101 UNDP, you name it. Like I've been invited to some Thich Nhat Hanh inspired consultants running a kind of conscious food systems lab inside the UNDP. Lots of interesting conversations going on. And we're still looking at the food system, and we're looking at the water system, and we're looking at the energy system, and we're looking at the health system. And we very rarely look at the observer. We rarely look at the narrative that informs all of that. And all of them are connected. And then when you try to bring that into the room, people kind of go, oh, that was a really inspiring talk, and that was really interesting, but let's get practical now. So where were we with our food systems thing? We need to get this stuff done by 2024, because then we run out of funding. And then we publish a report and nobody reads the report. And they've wasted so many wonderful people's time who actually try to make a difference. And how do we overcome that? How do we make a food? Like, I think that food, and one of my, like, if you haven't seen her work, if you're working in agriculture, the work of Helena Norberg Hodge and the International Society for Ecology and Culture, and even her wonderful, by now quite old book, Ancient Futures, it's really, like, when I studied at Schumacher College in 2001, she was the one that actively, locally campaigned for a local food economy and a relationship of people with their place through the food they were eating. And then the big Tesco's and so on started putting food miles on the stickers and stuff, but she really got that conversation going. And this entry point of food to place, to water, to watershed, to our health, to the fact that we are a walking ecosystem with more non-human cells than human cells, that your gut and my gut are full of an ecosystem without which we wouldn't have health, and which critically depends on what food we put inside of us in terms of what ecosystems we have. And this is, again, like having you on the call, like the Asian cultures knew always that you need to eat kimchi and those things to get the microorganisms to build health. We need to bring those kind of deeply lived participatory engagement with place into modern culture? How do you make kimchi and do Zoom calls and grow a food forest and still make a living for your family? That's new ways of living together.
Remember the interview you did with Dennis Meadows? I think 2 years ago, something like that. You asked him in that interview, do you still see a potential for us as a species to respond to the reality that we are heading for collapse? Where he actually responds that they notice that there is some sort of very attractive, sustainable society ahead of us, if we can just find it, is now a fantasy. The global population, its use of materials, its generation of waste has grown so far above the sustainable capacity of the planet that there's nothing ahead that looks like this sustainable utopia people talk about. Oops. And then you seem to be much more optimistic in this interview with Dennis. And I'm just wondering, also based on the comments that you made today, where are you today with hope, despair, optimism?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I think it fluctuates, I think probably for all of us. For a long time, and I still like, there's a wonderful conversation talking about different conversations on this topic. Like definitely this one with Dennis was eye-opening for me also, to have an elder like him quite so clearly speak it was a really interesting experience. But there's another conversation. If you look up "Do More Optimism" and you put Nora Bates and Kate Rayworth, Joe Brewer and Daniel Wahl into a search engine, it'll pop up. Like in this conversation with Kate and Nora and Joe, like Joe's always taken this approach of like, I'm only even going to work with people who take collapse for granted and start from there. And I never sit very comfortable if somebody leads with bit like one of my talking mentors earlier. I had the pleasure of actually being taught Gaia theory by James Lovelock 20 years ago. And even 20 years ago, I disagreed with James Lovelock on some of his views regarding nuclear energy and growing food in test tubes and so on. But he's definitely demonstrated that he's brilliant and that his scientific predictions have more than once come true and started whole fields. Like the whole field of Earth system climate science is basically coming out of an insight that he had in the 1960s, that the world is like, life is creating conditions conducive to life, like Jeanine Benyus coined it, but really his understanding that the reason why we have a chemical disequilibrium in the atmosphere of the biosphere is because life itself drives this chemical disequilibrium, and through that allows more life to flourish. None of the other planets have that chemical disequilibrium. And so he said to the first Mars mission, you can waste all that money and go to Mars to try to find life. I can tell you there is no significant life there, because look at this planet. That's the footprint of life. And so this guy is a genius. The reason I'm bringing that up is that James says, the end of the 21st century, we will have 500 million people on planet Earth. Sit with that for a bit and then talk about hope and despair. Going up to 9 billion and then 8.5 billion people disappearing off the face of the planet within 2.5 generations, 2 generations, living with that trauma, finding a story powerful enough that says, and still we can go beyond that meaningfully as a species. Whoa. And what all these kind of race to blah, 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 and now we're gonna, and self-congratulating white middle class, not upper class men solving the world, me included. I don't know. I know enough of these people to know that they really care and they really want to make a difference. And I also can see that we need these gradual stepping stone horizon 2- conversations, so something moves. And we can sometimes co-opt the system into a horizon 2+ stepping stone towards a transformative world. But Dennis was right. Like, I think that desirable eco-society is not going to be an Elon Musk, everybody drives a Tesla type world. That is just a techno fantasy that is actually surprisingly primitive for somebody who is clearly intelligent. This is like so to come to a quicker point with an answer, where am I with all this? I had, because my daughter has been in school for the first year and all of that, I just got every virus that came my way, and I was ill for 3 months in a row earlier this year. And with that came a wash of neurotransmitters that are normally not quite so abundant in my system. And suddenly I was much more pessimistic than I normally am. And in many ways, that pessimism had an effect on me. And it finally pushed me to this, okay, maybe you've been a bit too hard with this. Like Kate in this conversation says, well, you need all the roles. You need the people saying, there's an iceberg, we're going to crash. And you need other people. And she herself says, I'm just not the iceberg pointer. I do other things. I do local donut economy, community, participatory action to create capacity. And I think both are important, but where I've come to in this question is that more and more taking what James Lovelock has described as one scenario for the end of this century. Maybe it's not going to be that extreme, but it's going to be pretty extreme. How do we come together as one species and use every single bit of energy and material resource we have really, really wisely? How do we have the mature conversation about the use of technology to then say, yes, we love this. It's amazing that we can have a kind of almost council-like sharing via Zoom in different places. But this has a footprint, and that means we cannot consume all this other stuff. We need to somehow more wisely regulate how much access we have to this technology. And how do we do that without some kind of top-down ecological civilization, big brother is watching you and giving you your allocated little bit of this and that, and you just become a cog in a big apparatchik machine. I don't think that that's the emergent living life flowing through us way of becoming expressions of place again. So this whole ecological civilization conversation that Jeremy Lent is like, I love his work, and he makes the point that it has to be through local, but it's so, the meme is so dangerous to talk about in an ecological civilization. It's very distinct from the plural regenerative cultures that are place-sourced and place-based. They are two fundamentally different ways of approaching this. And again, I keep doing loops over this question. I'm coming back and back to this point of saying, how would we act differently if we accepted that collapse is inevitable and has been going on for 50 years? That pretty much all of us lived through a collapsing system in its final throes of resilience. And it's become more unequal and more destructive, not better. Even if the dialogue has picked up and the awareness has picked up. What would we do if we just hit the button and said, okay, can we stop this bullshit and become human again, to the point of saying, how do we support people if we know it's all going to crumble? Because there's deep wisdom in the outcome or deliverable is capacity, not the solution. Because if you assume that you might be moving into a future where every single solution you're currently basing your daily life on will come into question, then you're going to focus on, well, what capacity do I have in my community to make decisions and come together to respond to unforeseeable, unpredictable novelty? And it's a very different way of being. And yeah, we're going to have an argument of, yes, but there are these beautiful virtual communities, and we could form one, we'd get on. Yeah? But how do we live that tension of saying, how wonderful the whole is becoming conscious of itself through each and every one of us. And at the same time, we are connecting as cells in this larger body to reflect the jeweled net of Indra onto each other to make sense out of this participation. I love it. That's why I spoke to you. That's because I love these conversations. And ultimately, what we're talking about when we're with hope and despair, I'm not sure where our role is in the spectrum between local action and knowing your neighbor and working with your neighbor and your community and listening to the guy with the exact opposite end of the spectrum in terms of opinion. And understand that when push comes to shove, you're in the same boat, and that boat is your bioregion. And you better find ways of taking care of that place together from the outset, in the understanding that you will never agree with each other on everything. And that's wonderful, because that diversity is part of the creativity of life coming through us to help us find solutions. But we need to want to find the solutions together, and we need to understand the original instructions that life forgives an immature species 5 or 10,000 years of agriculture, but not 100,000. And if we don't get it, we don't get it. And it would be a shame.
Yes, wow. Quite something, Daniel.
Not the guy who brings in the positive at the moment, but there is a positive in there somehow.
Yeah, well, I bet, as everything has a positive and a negative in it.
I mean, I can tell you that the positive from my side, which is that I think the magic will happen when we sit so deeply with the grief that you're now feeling and that I feel with a 5-year-old in the next room. That we understand that through letting go and knowing that we don't matter that much, through not taking ourselves too serious, we might just find a way of being and living together through what's coming that somehow will turn into what we're meant to do. And that whoever comes through it will come through it with a narrative strong enough, a bit like the Great Flood narrative, that we restarted and life was worth it, and we found a new relationship to place, through life, through this mystery. And I think that it's precisely that grief. It's like Joanna Macy, before she called it the work that reconnects, to make the loop with the early conversation about the nuclear holocaust and all that, she actually called her work originally despair and empowerment work. And it was all around confronting the horror of a nuclear holocaust and the confrontation between East and West. And then when that dissolved, she took that work into what is now the work that reconnects. And she called it the great turning for a long, long time. And then started to question that herself for 2 reasons. For the one reason that the great turning still does what Marcus was pointing to, this progress idea, that the solution is always around the corner. Like if we only create this utopia of regenerative cultures, we will all live happily ever after. No, find the regeneration in the culture that you're in the middle of and see that it's already there. It's life getting through them, but we need to make it visible. We need to connect it. We need to fan those embers and see that in our imperfections, it's here right now that we can make the difference, not tomorrow. And so the great turning is a bit of a still progress-based framing of one day we'll have a better world. No. And the other bit is that she's not calling it the great turning anymore. She's calling it the great unraveling. And that's accepting collapse in order to move from there.